this is what I found to be a problem. Because when I started getting interested in new urbanism, I got really excited about these mixed-use communities that were really popping up everywhere in Florida. And I always found this mildly awkward, but I kind of went with it. Like, this is essentially just an inverted suburban shopping center calling itself new urbanist. And Andres Duani mentioned this yesterday morning in his presentation, how unfortunately we do get these strange hybrids that call themselves new urbanists, but don't really understand the main principles of what makes new urbanism special, and really does nothing to change the transportation landscape. So I start off with two hypotheses. First is that using a historical precedent and observing existing design factors, we can say that physical environments can influence people's transportation decisions, and that, that should be number 2 right there. Urban and suburban no longer refers to economic and geographical hierarchies, but distinct types of transportation decisions, especially since so many jobs have gone to the suburbs already. It really becomes a question of physical design and how people move around and engage in economic activity. So I decided on 4 scales to analyze these pseudo-urban hybrids. The first one is the immediate scale, and whether a stationary pedestrian can feel like they're in an urban place. In the case of this scene in Celebration, Florida, it's absolutely true. It's very pedestrian-friendly and walkable. There are diverse commercial needs. It's safe. You're unlikely to get hit by a car. But then if we go to, I call it the local scale, which is more the neighborhood site scale, usually within a 5-minute pedestrian shed. This is where people can start to get a sense of the urban fabric as a mental map of streets and blocks that are often missing in the semi-new urbanist hybrids. And then I call this a mesoscale or contextual scale. Celebration is moderately problematic in this sense that in its immediate context, if you're a driver, the environment becomes rather pedestrian unfriendly, even pedestrian hostile, with the freeways over there and the large parking lots. And then of a larger urban metropolitan scale, the little A pin at the bottom there is where Celebration is. You start to notice that Celebration is urban at a very human scale, but it becomes suburban as you get more farther out. I also wanted to specify the difference between places that are walkable and places that are pedestrian friendly. The example on the left is in Casablanca, Morocco, where, let's see if I can use the pen here. Yes. So this is a business school right here. This is a park. Over here is a supermarket, and here's high-density housing. So it sounds like a pretty interesting mixed-use community. Unfortunately, the sidewalks are made of dirt, and when you want to cross the street, there is a large median that isn't universally accessible. So that's a place where people can feasibly walk from one place to another, but it's not particularly safe or pleasant. On the other hand, Florida has some spectacularly pedestrian-friendly suburban communities that have lovely separated pedestrian paths along lakes and through natural areas. And it's pedestrian-friendly in the sense that a car is extraordinarily unlikely to hit you in that type of place, but people aren't encouraged to walk from their houses to commercial areas. And before moving on, it's also important to acknowledge that land use and transportation policies do help to shape this a lot. So here are 2 more or less contemporaneous developments. The one on the left is Northport, Florida, where I lived in for a few years in my childhood. The community started being built around 1959, and it's a typical suburban subdivision-based community, extraordinarily car-dependent, and although the city has been putting in some more sidewalks, the density is just extraordinarily low to encourage people to actually walk. Whereas in 1966 in the Netherlands, with their superb policies of intensifying both urban and rural developments, this is Houten, just outside of Utrecht, which is one of the major cities in the central southern part of the Netherlands. It's transit-oriented development with a pedestrian-oriented center and a commuter rail line running right through the middle of the town. So what does make a place urban? I spent a lot of time looking at maps and satellite images and found that, and this is also in the chart of new urbanism, the block and the street should be the 2 main guiding physical design principles in any place where you want to encourage walkability. And this is extraordinarily strongly ingrained in the American physical design history. For instance, in this old map of Philadelphia, you can see how the blocks run into the Schuylkill River, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but they run straight into the river without a notion of path-based design so much. But blocks and streets don't have to be right angles. So in the case of Sarasota, Florida, you can see lots of interesting geometric shapes and in a walkable environment. Or in Boston, that's another example of a place where the grid is not entirely orthogonal. So what makes a place suburban? So looking at the start of suburban places, we saw that, I noticed that they were largely driven by park landscape design. So when you're in a park, of course, you don't need to organize a park in streets and blocks because it's more so about the movement of the pedestrian in a place. And if we look at Llewellyn Park in New Jersey, I think that's the design of the park itself rather than the suburb, but the design of parks and paths in parks started paralleling the designs of streets in suburban subdivisions, which I thought was an interesting notion that now we weren't so much focusing on the block as a unit, but really on how people were moving around. So what can we do to avoid pseudo-urban hybrids, such as Abacoa, Jupiter, Florida, which is in South Florida, where the main unit of physical design isn't the block and the street, but rather the same suburban paths of movement. For instance, with parking lot paths that aren't particularly distinct as streets or just a path in a parking lot, or this excessively wide, things like 6 or 7 lane highway running right through the middle of the commercial area. Or in the case of Main Street in Lakewood Ranch, Florida, which is in Southwest Florida, where yes, when you're inside the Main Street area, it feels like an urban place, but you're surrounded by a sea of parking lot and people aren't going to be walking there from anywhere around it. Or in the case of West Park Village in Tampa, where it is organized in a street and grid fashion, but the connections don't exist to the nearby neighborhoods, creating a large-scale cul-de-sac. Or Winter Park Village, which is in a naturally occurring retirement community outside Orlando, where it's the same idea of an inverted suburban strip mall. And this is actually an interesting example because it's a gated community, and new urbanism really should not be gated if your goal is to influence an entire city's transportation choice. So I came up with a step-by-step question framework that steps through the 4 layers of spatial analysis to identify what these developments consistently do incorrectly and what we can do to solve them. So first, at the immediate scale, do buildings from the streets and sidewalks directly. And this is something, it isn't a new idea at all, but unfortunately we keep making the same mistakes. For instance, in Austin, Texas, where this high-density residential development is just outside UT Austin, but the main entrances into and out of the building don't front directly to the street, making the pedestrian have to walk larger distances within the building just to get out. And is parking provided in blocks or as parts of plazas? This, I have to say, is my favorite parking lot of all time in Venice, Florida. Venice was a city designed by John Nolan. What I find spectacular about this parking lot in the center is that there are very clearly defined vehicular and pedestrian realms. And the parking lot is a distinct unit within the existing urban grid. So zooming out to the neighborhood level scale, streets absolutely must be distinct for parking lots. I'll be showing an example later on where a street becomes a parking lot path, and that just helps to dissolve any feeling of urbanity in it. And is a system of streets and blocks legible to pedestrians? Kevin Lynch did a lot of work with urban mental mapping, and I'm a proponent of the idea that if a pedestrian can create a clear sense of what does 1 or 2 blocks over mean, that can really help encourage them to walk. And at an even larger scale, does the site connect to its surroundings? So in Shadyside, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you can clearly see how the street grid and the networks really expand everywhere. Whereas in Tioga, which is a town center, they call it, in Gainesville, Florida, which is northern Florida, it's really just one extraordinarily long cul-de-sac without any connections to its neighboring subdivisions. So there's really no point in calling that mixed use. Well, I guess it is mixed use, but no point in calling it new urbanism if you're not changing the city's transportation landscape. And this is a bit beyond what I was looking at, but in general, these walkable commercial nodes should ideally connect to larger transportation networks. And now as one final example, I'll be looking at this development called Bay Street Village and Town Center, which is just about 5 minutes from my high school in Osprey, Florida, about an hour and a half-ish south of Tampa. And if you look at it and imagine over there towards the left is the commercial area, and over to the right are the residential areas. They broke ground in 2006, but unfortunately, well, I guess moderately unfortunately in a sense, the project stopped in 2008 with the Great Recession, unfortunately the residential part, it ended up becoming a gated subdivision rather than being used as an opportunity to really create a walkable town center for Osprey. So here's the immediate scale. I took this photo back in 2012, and it feels like a kind of urban Main Street in a sense. But if you zoom out just slightly to the local scale, there are a few problems. Here, there are no connections to the adjacent residential neighborhoods, very weak connections across this major highway, despite there were other proposals to fix this connectivity issue. But there aren't any sidewalks to existing commercial areas and civic areas. So there's a church just more or less over here. There's a store here, an old gas station here, and a Walmart over here, but no sidewalks connecting anybody there. And in the mesoscale, we noticed that if we actually took the effort to make this a deliberately walkable town center, it could succeed, especially because if we compare Osprey to its neighbor to the north, Sarasota, we see that there's the traditional gridded residential area on a highway, on the waterfront, and so geographically in terms of comparative land use, it would make economic sense to have a walkable town center there. But unfortunately, because there weren't the pedestrian scale connections and crosswalks connecting to neighborhoods, and no notion of a street and block system, even if the project were built out as expected, it would have been unlikely to succeed in changing Osprey's transportation landscape. Thank you.